K2 has earned the name Savage Mountain for good reason. With a fatality rate of 23 deaths for every 100 successful summits, it's one of the deadliest climbs in the world. One wrong move, one unexpected storm, and the mountain claims another life. In this video, we explore K2's deadly history and share the tragic stories of those who never made it back. K2, standing at 8,611 meters, is the second highest mountain on Earth, located on the border between Pakistan and China in the Karakoram Range, and it holds a notorious reputation due to its deadly conditions. It is significantly more dangerous than Everest. K2's treacherous death zone, unpredictable weather, frequent rockfalls, and technical climbing sections all contribute to its high mortality rate, making it one of the most dangerous peaks on the planet. But what drives climbers to attempt the impossible? For many, the allure of K2 is simple. It represents a monumental achievement, one that fewer people have attained than have journeyed into space. By the mid-20th century, all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks had been conquered. But in the early 1900s, K2 stood as an untouchable giant, daring adventurers to try. The first serious attempt to conquer K2 occurred in 1902, led by British mountaineer Oscar Eckenstein. The team, which included notable climbers like Aleister Crowley, Jules Jacot-Guillermaud, Heinrich Fannel, Victor Wessely, and Guy Knowles, set out via the Northeast Ridge, hoping to make history. In the early 1900s, the region was incredibly remote, with no modern transportation, requiring a grueling 14-day journey just to reach the foot of the mountain. The climb itself was far from straightforward. Throughout 5 costly and difficult attempts, the team only managed to reach an altitude of 6,525 meters. Their efforts were met with numerous challenges, including poor weather, which allowed only 8 clear days out of the 68 they spent on the mountain. Personality conflicts also plagued the team, as did health issues. Crowley, for example, was still suffering from the effects of malaria. The mountain would claim its first victims during a fateful expedition in 1939, led by Fritz Wiesner, who had gained a reputation as one of the greatest mountaineers of his time. However, assembling a team for this ambitious climb proved challenging. Many of the most experienced climbers of the era declined the invitation to join Wiesner, leaving him with a group of relatively inexperienced men. These included George Sheldon, Chappell Cranmer, Jack Durrance, and George Trench, with Eaton Cromwell and Dudley Wolfe also joining the team under the leadership of Fritz Wiesner. Alongside them were some Sherpas whose invaluable knowledge of the region and extreme altitudes made them indispensable. The Sherpa team was led by Pasang Kikuli and included Pasang Dawa Lama, one of the strongest high-altitude climbers of the time, alongside others like Pasang Kitar, Tsering Norbu, Finsu, and Tse Tendrup. The team set out to climb via the Abruzzi Ridge, the same route attempted by the Duke of Abruzzi in 1909. This route, although considered the most viable, was by no means easy. It required ascending a steep, exposed ridge with numerous dangerous sections, including the notorious bottleneck, a narrow, vertical crevice overshadowed by a precarious hanging column of glacial ice. Even experienced climbers tread carefully in this section, where falling ice and avalanches are common. Despite these dangers, Wiesner and his team began their ascent in high spirits. Early on, Wiesner's confidence in his abilities led him to often climb far ahead of the others, causing strain within the group. The rest of the team struggled to keep up, especially since many were less experienced and lacked the stamina or technical skills necessary for such an ambitious climb. Still, they managed to establish base camps and make steady progress up the mountain. By the time they reached Camp 4, the cracks within the team began to show. Jack Durrance, an American medical student who had joined the team late, lacked proper high-altitude boots, forcing him to slow down, and some of the others were starting to feel the effects of altitude sickness and exhaustion. The extreme conditions and lack of coordination became evident as bad weather began to take their toll. The first major setback came when Tony Cromwell, who had been appointed deputy leader, and George Sheldon were forced to descend due to frostbite and injuries. Their departure weakened the already struggling group, but Wiesner and his trusted Sherpa, Pasang Dawa Lama, continued pushing forward with several others, determined to make it to the top. They reach Camp 6, situated just below the Black Pyramid, a formidable section of steep, rocky terrain. This part of the climb was exceptionally difficult, with its rugged landscape and exposure to harsh winds. Wiesner's leadership, while strong, began to create tension among the team. His habit of pressing forward without waiting for the others caused further disconnection, and by the time they neared the bottleneck, a critical moment arose that would define the expedition. Dudley Wolfe, one of the wealthiest members of the group, had joined the expedition primarily due to his admiration for Wiesner and a desire to prove himself. However, Wolfe, who lacked the mountaineering experience and physical endurance of the others, began to lag behind. By the time they reached Camp 8, Wolfe was exhausted, suffering from altitude sickness and struggling to move forward. In a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, Wiesner left Wolfe at Camp 8, promising to return after securing the summit. Wolfe, left alone at 7,700 meters, had minimal supplies and no way to descend by himself. Meanwhile, Wiesner and Pasang Dawa Lama continued climbing. They reached a point just 240 meters below the summit, agonizingly close to the top. But Pasang, ever cautious, urged Wiesner to turn back, pointing out the dangers of continuing so late in the day. Despite his deep desire to reach the summit, Wiesner reluctantly agreed. They began their descent, hoping that they could still make another attempt once they regrouped. When Wiesner and Pasang Dawa Lama returned to Camp 8, they found Dudley Wolfe still there, but in terrible condition. Wolfe had been left behind at Camp 8, where he had been alone for days with no supplies, no food, and no way to melt snow for water. Wiesner was shocked to find that no additional supplies had been sent up from the lower camps, which were crucial for Wolfe's survival. At this point, Wiesner and Pasang were also running dangerously low on energy, food, and gear. Though they wanted to help Wolfe, they were physically unable to assist him without first retrieving more supplies from the lower camps. The Sherpas who had been stationed at the lower camps had mistakenly assumed that Wiesner and Pasang had perished in the storm and had started descending the mountain, taking valuable supplies with them. Wiesner and Pasang had no choice but to leave Wolfe temporarily at Camp 8 and descend in search of help and supplies. This decision, although painful, was made out of necessity since neither Wiesner nor Pasang were in any condition to assist Wolfe in their weakened state. Back at Camp 2, Wiesner confronted the others, accusing them of abandoning Wolfe and neglecting their duties. A heated argument ensued, but it became clear that Wolfe's life was in immediate danger. A rescue attempt had to be made. The first rescue mission was organized with Jack Durrance, Pasang Dawa Lama, and several Sherpas setting off to reach Wolfe at Camp 8. However, the team, already weakened by days of grueling conditions, could only manage to reach Camp 4 before exhaustion forced them to turn back. Pasang Dawa Lama, who had been Wiesner's closest partner during the climb, was ordered to return to base camp, too tired to continue any further. Despite the failure of the first attempt, a second rescue mission was launched. This time, it was led by elite Sherpas Pasang Kikuli and Sering Norbu, along with several others. These Sherpas displayed incredible strength, climbing over 2,100 meters in a single day, reaching Camp 6 in what was one of the most impressive high-altitude climbs of the time. When they finally reached Wolfe at Camp 8, they were met with a heartbreaking sight. Wolfe was still alive, but barely. He had been lying in his tent for days, weak from the lack of food and water, and was covered in his own waste. Despite the dire situation, Wolfe seemed indifferent to his predicament. He refused to descend, even when the Sherpas handed him letters from the rest of the team urging him to come down. Instead, he told the Sherpas to return the next day, saying he would be ready to descend then. The Sherpas, confused by Wolfe's lack of urgency, had no choice but to leave him behind temporarily. They descended to Camp 6, where they were trapped by a fierce storm for 2 days. The weather on K2 had turned again, as it often does, making any further rescue attempts impossible. When the storm finally passed, the Sherpas made a third and final attempt to reach Wolfe. This time, Pasang Kikuli, Pasang Kitar, and Finsu set off for Camp 8. Sadly, they were never seen again. None of the Sherpas returned, and Wolfe remained lost on the mountain. Days passed without any sign of the rescue team, and the grim reality set in that Wolfe and the Sherpas had perished on K2. The last surviving Sherpa from the rescue team, Sering Norbu, was left at Camp 6. After waiting as long as he could, he finally descended the mountain to inform Wiesner and the others at base camp that the rescue attempt had failed. The Sherpas were gone, and there was nothing more they could do to save Wolf. The devastated team made one final attempt to reach Wolf and the missing Sherpas. However, a massive storm rolled in, blocking their path and forcing them to retreat. After a week of waiting, it was clear that Wolf and the Sherpas had been claimed by K2's harsh conditions. Their bodies were never recovered, and they remained somewhere high on the mountain's icy slopes, lost to the savage mountain forever. The 1939 K2 expedition ended in tragedy with the loss of Dudley Wolf and 3 Sherpas, Pasang Kikuli, Pasang Kitar, and Finsu. The aftermath of the expedition was filled with blame and controversy. Wiesner was criticized for leaving Wolf behind, and the failure of the rescue attempts sparked heated debates within the climbing community. Some blamed Wiesner, while others pointed fingers at the rest of the team for abandoning the high camps. The American Alpine Club launched an investigation, but no clear conclusions were reached. In the end, the 1939 K2 expedition serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers of high-altitude mountaineering. Wolf and the Sherpas who perished on the mountain are remembered as the first victims of the savage mountain, their story a tragic chapter in the history of mountaineering. But the 1939 expedition was far from the last disaster. Over the years, K2 would claim many more lives and leave a trail of tragic stories. It eventually got the name Savage Mountain by American climber George Bell after the 1953 K2 expedition led by Fritz Wiesner, which ultimately failed to reach the summit. On July 31, 1954, Achille Compagnoni and Lino Lacedelli became the first people to stand atop K2. The mountain had finally been conquered. But even this victory didn't diminish the deadly reputation the mountain had earned. Other teams followed in the footsteps of the Italian climbers, each with varying degrees of success. But K2 remained relatively quiet, with fewer disasters compared to the early attempts. That changed in 1986. It was a season that would go down in history as one of the deadliest on K2. One tragedy followed after another, creating a string of disasters. During the summer months from June to August, the Pakistani government granted an unprecedented number of climbing permits, allowing nearly 66 people to attempt the summit. The weather was typical for K2, unpredictable and harsh, but climbers pressed on, driven by the lure of standing atop the world's second highest peak. The most coveted route that year was the unclimbed South Pillar, a technical challenge at high altitude that had earned the nickname the Magic Line. It was known as one of the last great problems of K2, demanding extreme precision, strength, and endurance. 10 teams attempted the climb that season, but for many of them, the mountain would soon show its deadly nature. The first major incident occurred on June 21st, when John Smolich, an American climber, and his partner Alan Pennington were ascending the base of their route. High above them, the sun loosened a massive truck-sized rock from the ice. The boulder tumbled down the mountain, triggering a deep fracture line that shot across the slope, causing a massive avalanche. In a matter of seconds, both climbers were buried under tons of snow and ice. While Pennington was quickly located by other climbers, it was too late to save him. His body was retrieved, but Smolik was never found, leaving the American team devastated and forcing them to call off their climb. Despite this tragic start, the climbing season continued. Just 2 days later, on June 23rd, a team of French and Polish climbers successfully reached the summit via the Abruzzi Spur. On that day, Polish mountaineer Wanda Rutkiewicz became the first woman to summit K2 without supplementary oxygen. She was part of a small expedition led by French climbers Liliane and Maurice Berard. But their victory quickly turned tragic. A fierce storm hit as they descended, leaving the team exhausted and vulnerable. Wanda made it down, but the Berards were not so fortunate. They became disoriented and separated during the storm, ultimately perishing on the mountain. K2 had claimed more lives, but for the determined climbers still pushing for the summit, this was not enough to stop them. Among those still determined to climb was Polish climber Jerzy Kukuczka. He had a personal mission to become the first person to climb all 14 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks, and K2 was a critical part of that journey. Kukuczka and his partner, Tadeusz Piotrowski, pushed themselves to the limit, climbing the magic line in pure alpine style, without the use of bottled oxygen. After a grueling ascent, they reached the summit on July 8th, but their descent was a nightmare. Exhausted and suffering from frostbite, Piotrowski's gear malfunctioned, and he lost control while descending. Kukuczka could only watch in horror as his partner tumbled down the mountain, disappearing into the clouds below. Another life lost to K2's deadly grasp. And yet, the deadly summer of 1986 was far from over. Despite these mounting casualties, climbers continued to push for the summit. Among them was Italian solo climber Renato Casarotto, a cautious and highly skilled mountaineer. Casarotto was attempting the magic line as well, and by July 16th, he was within 1,000 feet of the summit. However, he sensed that the weather was turning and made the decision to abandon his climb. As he descended, other climbers watched in horror as the snow beneath his feet gave way and he fell 120 feet into a crevasse. Miraculously, he survived the fall and managed to call for help via his walkie-talkie. A rescue party was quickly assembled, and after a long and dangerous effort, they managed to pull Casarotto from the crevasse. But the mountain had already taken its toll. Though he survived the fall, Casarotto succumbed to his injuries shortly after being rescued. Another tragedy, another life lost, adding to the season's growing death toll. As July turned into August, the situation on K2 became increasingly dire. On August 3rd, Wojciech Wróż, a highly respected Polish climber and member of a combined Slovak-Polish team, reached the summit via the challenging Southwest Pillar, also known as the Magic Line, without the use of bottled oxygen. However, their triumph was overshadowed by tragedy. During the descent, Wróż, exhausted and suffering from the effects of hypoxia, slipped off the end of a fixed rope and fell to his death. The death toll for the season of 1986 climbed to 8, and the mountain was still not finished. On August 10th, after days of being trapped by a relentless storm, a group of climbers made a desperate bid to descend. Alan Rouse, one of Britain's most accomplished climbers, was among them. Suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, the group struggled through waist-deep snow, fighting against the wind and cold. One by one, they began to collapse. 2 climbers, unable to continue, were left behind in the snow while the others pressed on. By the time they reached Camp 3, it had been destroyed by an avalanche, leaving them with no shelter. As night fell, the storm raged on, and the group was forced to spend the night exposed to the elements. The next morning, Rouse, who had been in a state of delirium for days, was too weak to continue. His companions did what they could to make him comfortable, but they knew there was no hope of getting him down the mountain. In a final act of survival, the remaining climbers made their way down to base camp, barely alive. When they arrived, only 2 of the original group remained. The summer of 1986 had claimed 13 lives, making it the deadliest season in K2's history. In the years that followed, the savage mountain continued to claim more lives. It really makes you wonder why people would continue to climb this mountain, knowing how deadly it is. Perhaps that is the reason. Perhaps sometimes flirting with death makes one feel alive, until they aren't.